Hi everyone, and welcome back to class. So in today's video, what we're going to talk about is Descartes' ontological argument. Now this argument can be found in his book, Meditations on First Philosophy, and they can be found within the third and fifth meditations. Now, if you haven't read the Meditations on First Philosophy before, go ahead and do it. It's a good, easy read. I think altogether it's about 30 to 40 pages, depending on your translation. And, while the language can be extremely complicated or filled with jargon, a little bit convoluted, it is an easily accessible read if you take your time and go through it. There are many resources out there that you can consult to help you understand the meditations as you work your way through them, but they are a very good piece of philosophical literature to familiarize yourself with. I do highly suggest that you at least familiarize yourself with his arguments in the first and second meditation before jumping into the ontological argument, just because the first and second meditation really give us the foundation that we're working with when we get to the ontological argument. But if you're just jumping into this to discover what his ontological argument was, hopefully this video will be of a lot of help and assistance for you. So, what is an ontological argument? Well, to define this, we need to define two other things first. We need to define what is known as rationalism and what is known as empiricism. And the reason we have to define this is because in the modern period, one of the main reasons Descartes becomes considered the father of modern philosophy, outside of his arguments in the Meditations, is that he really helps to set a precedent and foundation for what is known as rationalism, while some of his contemporaries go the opposite route and argue for empiricism. And it's this argument between rationalism and empiricism that really helps to define the modern period of philosophy. So rationalism is the idea that we can gain knowledge simply through reason, that we can use our reason and our intellect to form premises and arguments that will lead us to a clear and definite conclusion free of any empirical evidence. What empirical evidence is the idea of evidence that is based in experience. So empiricism is the idea that we gain knowledge and information not just from reason alone, but also from experience. Experiential evidence. And this is what empirical evidence is. So empiricism says that we can learn that things are hot and cold, that things are bitter and sweet, from experiencing them. We can learn about the way that the world and nature and the physical realm works through experience. We live it. Rationalism argues that we don't need that empirical base. We don't need experiential evidence. Instead, we can just learn things from reason. We can put two and two together in our minds and discover anything about the world through reason alone. So our good friend René Descartes was a rationalist, and his ontological argument is where we really get a very big taste of this. Because at this point in the Meditations, he's kind of thrown everything to the wayside and said, if I can't know it with certainty, I can't know it at all, and it's gotta go away. By the end of the second meditation, he's only really come back to believing one thing, and that is that he himself exists, that he is a thinking thing. And this is, of course, where we got cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and he has established that. That is his foundational belief. But at this point, he needs to now discover whether or not anything else he once believed is true or can be known with certainty. And this currently considers God, the five senses, and whether the physical world is a real thing. Now, when it comes down to the idea of God, he needs to discover whether God exists, and whether God, if God does exist, is a deceiver, if God could be that evil genius that he talks about in the first and second meditation. So in Meditations 3 and 5, we get his ontological argument on God, in which he proves God's existence using rationalism and reason, at least according to his account, that's what he does. His contemporaries and many contemporary philosophers would probably argue whether he is actually successful at proving that God exists, but that's not the argument for today. Instead, we're just going to go through the motions of what his argument was and how he believes he concluded, which he believes that at the end of Meditations 3 and 5, he has concluded that God does exist and that he's done so through rationalism, through reason alone. In Meditation 4, which we're not going to cover in this video, I'll cover that in another video, he goes over whether God could or could not be a deceiver. He looks at why we make mistakes and how we are deceived. And so he does kind of prove all of this over time, but we're not going to talk about that one here. We're just going to focus on the ontological argument here in this video. So, one of the first things that Descartes looks to argue in meditation number 3 is he looks to give us two premises that will help further his ontological argument later on. And the first premise he gives us is he wants to define what it is to be certain of something. And so he argues that to be certain of something is to know it clearly and distinctly. This is where we get the concept of clear and distinct ideas. So that is Descartes' first premise that we get at the start of meditation number 3. To know something with certainty is to know it clearly and distinctly. The second premise that we get at the start of meditation number 3 is the idea that for something to come into being, for something to come into existence, for something to be created, it must come from that which is equal to or greater than itself. Uh-oh. We have cat. For something to come into existence, it has to come from that which is greater than or equal to itself. So the example he gives, and that I was often taught in my own studies, was that of a boulder. A boulder can be broken down into smaller ideas. It can go into that which is lesser than itself. But two small rocks, cannot be crushed together to make a boulder. Instead, they will make rocks that are equal to themselves or that they are smaller than themselves. The same could be said of ideas. Ideas can only create ideas that are equal to or greater than themselves. And Descartes takes this idea further in meditation number 3 to apply to that of perfection. So these are the two premises that we get at the very start of meditation number 3. That for something to be certain, it must be clear and distinct, and that for something to come into being, it must come from that which is greater than or equal to itself. Descartes will use both of these in the third and fifth meditation to attempt to prove God rationally. So, how do these two premises lead us to the idea that God has to exist? Well, Descartes argues very quickly that the one thing he is certain of when it comes to the definition of God is that God is perfect. When Descartes says that God is perfect, he means that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. He's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. That's God. He's omnipotent, he's omniscient, and he's omnibenevolent. Descartes claims that he knows this clearly and distinctly, that he can know God is perfect clearly and distinctly, that he has no doubt in his mind that whenever God is brought into question, whenever God comes into his mind, that is what he knows of God, that God is perfect. God is all three of these things defined. Another thing that Descartes knows clearly and distinctly, not about God, but about himself, is that he is imperfect, that God is perfect and Descartes is imperfect. That threw me off a little bit. You can't see that out of the frame. I'm being stared at. He himself is questioning the existence of God. He wonders, could it be me? For I am ket. So Descartes knows that God is perfect and that he himself, Descartes, is imperfect. These are two things that he knows clearly and distinctly. Before he can conclude that God is the perfect being in the universe, he does have to come to a couple of other conclusions. One of which being, he asks himself, could I be God? Could I, Descartes, not me, Matt, be God? I do not have that level of hubris. I just have crazy kit. It's this idea that when it comes to the idea of God, he's only really still working with the first premise. He's working with this idea that to know something is to know it clearly and distinctly. And so he has clearly and distinctly defined that God is perfect and Descartes is imperfect. So before he moves on to the second premise, he wants to get a couple of things out of the way. First, he wants to ask himself, could I be God? And this is kind of the big thing that he needs to get out of the way. He wants to ask, could he, Descartes, be God, this perfect deity or being in the universe? Could he have willed himself into existence? And the argument he gives, it's pretty straightforward. He just claims no. There is no way that he, Descartes, could be God. The reason being that God is perfect and Descartes is imperfect. So the only way to bridge that gap would be to say that Descartes is an imperfect being on the way to godhood. But he argues that that doesn't make sense with his definition of God, this clear and distinct idea that God is perfect and that God is all-knowing or all-powerful, and he has no idea or reason to believe that he could be God in training. So he kind of throws out this idea that he himself has to be God. Instead, what he comes to the conclusion of is that there has to be something else in this universe, external to himself, that is perfect. Or at least that is better than he is. And this is where the second premise comes into play. This idea that to be created, you have to come from that which is greater than or equal to yourself. So Descartes takes this to its most logical conclusion, in that if he exists, Descartes, this imperfect being exists, then that which created him has to be perfect. It has to be God. Now you might be saying, well, no, Descartes' definition says that he could have been created by that which is equal to or greater than himself. So it doesn't have to be a perfect being that created Descartes. Something something that is imperfect could have created him. And you're not wrong. Yes, something that is imperfect could have created Descartes, but what created that? And if that's another imperfect being, or just a slightly better being, then what created that? And what created that? So on and so forth. So Descartes says that we should just jump to the end of the chain, go to the primal creator, and this primal creator would be God. This would be the perfect being that created beings of imperfection, namely us. So God is the perfect being that created Descartes. And so he kind of concludes Meditation 3 saying that the reason he knows God exists is because he knows that he, the imperfect being, exists. And this is where we start to see hints at his argument of negation. So when we talk about this argument of negation, what we mean is that Descartes knows something because it's what he lacks. He doesn't have it, but he knows the idea, he can clearly and distinctly define it, so it has to exist somewhere. When it comes to the idea of perfection, Descartes knows that he lacks perfection. He is an imperfect being, and so perfection has to exist somewhere. That place it has to exist is in God. So because he knows that he exists, Descartes exists as this imperfect being, he could not have willed himself into existence, there has to be another being out there that has perfection that could have created him. So this is where he concludes meditation number 3. He argues that he has now concluded a number of things with certainty. He claims that he knows that he exists as a thinking thing, cogito ergo sum, and that God exists. And that the reason God exists is because, or at least the reason he knows God exists, is because he, the imperfect being, exists. And so there has to be that perfect being out there to have created him. Now, in meditation number 4, this is where Descartes questions whether God is a good or bad deity, essentially whether God is a deceiver or not. And spoiler alert, no, God is not the deceiver according to Descartes' logic. And having concluded that God is not a deceiver, he moves on to meditation number 5, where he essentially looks to double down on the existence of God. He looks to try to argue, or at least to demonstrate, that God in existing has to exist, and that his existence is necessitated by his pure being. So let's talk about meditation number 5. Now, meditation number 5 is unique. It's interesting. Essentially, Descartes wants to double down on this argument of negation. He wants to try to prove that because God is perfect, God has to exist. In fact, the easiest way to define meditation 5 is to say that God is perfect, therefore God exists, and God exists because he is perfect. It's this kind of very cyclical argument that he has in the 5th meditation. So Descartes essentially begins by saying that, if you imagine God in your mind, you can imagine God clearly and distinctly as perfect. And you, because of your imagination, are capable of imagining things that don't exist in the physical world, or things that just don't exist in reality. Your mind is so powerful, your imagination is so powerful, that you can imagine monsters like chimeras and mutants and creatures of nightmare, and they're real in your mind, and you can imagine their qualities, their descriptions, their definitions clearly and distinctly. You can clearly and distinctly in your mind know what a chimera is when you imagine it in your mind. So you know it. And he says that the same is true of both God and the concept of perfection. He says that clearly and distinctly in his mind that he knows that God is perfect. And he knows clearly and distinctly in his mind that perfection has to exist. That perfection, in the definition of perfection, necessitates existence. That to be perfect is to exist. So, if God is perfect, as he clearly and distinctly knows, then God has to exist. As I said, it is this cyclical argument where he says, well, because God is perfect, and because perfection necessitates existence, then because God is perfect, God must exist. That's it. That's the 5th meditation in the most simplified nutshell possible. Now, there are other aspects and parts of the 5th meditation that we could discuss, but for the sake of this video and keeping this lesson generally short, especially because these videos are in part for my intro class, that's the basic aspect we're going to get from this. We're going to look at meditation number 5, and that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at this argument of God, where he essentially argues that because God is perfect, God must exist. And God must exist because, by definition, God is perfect. That's it. And so over the course of the 3rd and the 5th meditation, Descartes claims to have proven that God exists. And God exists because he is perfect. So at the end of all of this, Descartes has now defined 2 things that have to exist in the physical, or in not the physical world. We haven't gotten there yet. That's meditation number 6. He has defined 2 things that exist in the universe: himself and God. These are the two beings or entities that exist. Descartes, the imperfect one, and God, the perfect one. Come meditation number 6, which we'll look at in another video with meditation number 4, he argues about the senses and gets the physical world back and blah, 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 blah. We'll get there next time. Before we end this video, though, I do want to point out a couple of problems that people have with Descartes' ontological argument. First and foremost, David Hume. David Hume has a big problem. And a lot of Descartes' contemporaries had big problems with these meditations. In fact, so much so that when Descartes published the meditations, he actually published them after sending copies out to his friends so that they could be peer-reviewed, and he took their complaints and put them in an appendix in the back where he responded to their complaints, because he knew that there would be people with issues about the meditations. So Descartes himself knew that the meditations weren't perfect. He knew that there were problems with them and that people would have issues. David Hume was one of the big original detractors of the meditations. David Hume argued that to know what is clear and distinct is not a clear and distinct definition. What is it to be clear and distinct? To one person, one thing might be clear and distinct, while to another person, that's not clear. I mean, think about this. You've read a book before, and you claim to know it clearly and distinctly. You know what that book is about, and then you go back and reread it, or you go rewatch a movie that you've seen 1,000 times, and you don't remember it exactly as it was. It's not clear and distinct enough to know it with certainty. So David Hume has a problem, and a lot of people had a problem with this idea of what is clear and distinct. A lot of people have issues with Descartes' definition of God. How does Descartes know that God has to be perfect? How does Descartes know that God has to be omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent? Why can't God be one of those things or two of those things? Why all three, if any of them? Because different religions exist and different definitions and arguments of God exist. Descartes was working with the French Catholic definition of God. What makes his definition of God correct? You know, he knows it clearly and distinctly, but does that make it right? And so this is a bunch of the arguments we tend to see around Descartes' meditations. You know, the first and second meditation are almost universally agreed upon as being great. You know, the idea of cogito ergo sum is probably one of the only things people will 100% agree upon Descartes got right in the meditations. When it comes to the ontological argument, on the other hand, highly contested. There is a lot of argument as to whether Descartes successfully does anything in the third or fifth meditations. In fact, I had a coworker, I had a peer of mine explain to me that the meditations actually take on a brand new and very interesting look when you view them as though Descartes is an unreliable narrator. If you look at Descartes as an unreliable narrator, the third and fifth meditation take on a whole new light. Because if we look in a historical context, the time frame in which Descartes is talking about the meditations is one in which the Christian faith controlled Europe. And if you detracted from the Christian faith, if you were viewed as a heretic or a blasphemer, as many philosophers were afraid they would be viewed as, you could be sentenced to death. You could be executed. Descartes, in most of his other philosophy, rarely, if ever, talks about God. The man was a mathematician, was a scientist, was very stuck with this idea of skepticism and proving things beyond a certainty of a doubt, and was very careful in his logic and his language. So why is it he would have these very open problems in his meditations? Why would he leave that stuff there? And so if we view Descartes as an unreliable narrator, the third and fifth meditation can be looked at as kind of throwing the church off of his scent and appeasing the church in a way so that they don't execute him, so that they don't look at him and go, oh, well, he's blaspheming, or, oh, well, he's saying God isn't real, or that God doesn't exist. He's a heretic. Kill him. Instead, Descartes can point to the meditations and go, hey, I'm talking about math, I'm talking about science, but I'm on your side because I also proved God existed. Did that for you, church. Hey. So, let's look at my science and other stuff too and accept it as well, because I'm on your side. God exists. Yay. It's that kind of argument where he if he's viewed as an unreliable narrator, you can say that he's really just trying to get the church to accept math and science and philosophy by saying, well, I put this argument here for you. So I'm not saying God doesn't exist. I'm not taking away from God. I'm not going against you in any way. But here's these other good ideas that we can look at as well. It takes on this whole new light if you view Descartes as an unreliable narrator. So that's some food for thought for you. Well, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you've really enjoyed this video on Descartes' third and fifth meditation. I know that I technically haven't put up the video for the first and the second meditation yet. I'm going to go back and do that at another time. But I needed to get this video up up for everybody here. And it's one that I've kind of been dreading. I don't really like talking about Descartes' meditations when it comes to the third and the fifth. They are filled with logical inconsistencies for me, and so it becomes something that just becomes very difficult to discuss. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that I have been able to explain it to you all in a way that has helped you to understand it, because that's another reason it's a little difficult for me to always talk about the third and fifth meditation. I do find that a lot of students and first-time philosophers, the third and fifth meditation really become either defining moments where you latch on to philosophy and you like it and you learn to question and go with it, or it becomes one of the most confusing, confounded moments in your philosophical journey. And, teaching the third and fifth meditation has always just been one of those moments of like, I can do it, I like it, I know what it's about, but it's also like, oh god, dread and anxiety. I hope I do this right for you guys. I hope I give it to you in a way you can understand. So I really hope that I've helped to convey an understanding of the third and fifth meditation. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.